This Choircast podcast is brought to you by How to Not Suck as a Christian. This book is a witty, no BS guide to unlearning the toxic parts of Christianity, like purity culture, apologetics, and the idea that God's love is limited to straight conservative Americans. It's sharp, it's irreverent, and it'll definitely make your fundamentalist aunt clutch her pearls. You can get the audiobook on Audible. Print and ebooks of How to Not Suck as a Christian are available to ship to your aunt wherever books are sold.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney and Bethany Shea.
Hello, hello. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name is Nat. I am one of three hosts. That's the beautiful thing about this podcast. You get three hosts for the price of one.
A very cheap price.
Well, yeah, for the price of zero. We could add 10 more for the same price. We just keep going. Ain't nobody getting paid. Ain't nobody making money. That's just the way it goes here. We do this because we love it.
Yep. And we get to read amazing books.
And we get to read amazing books, and we get to meet amazing people.
It's true.
And if somebody someday feels like blessing us with, a huge chunk of cash, we should pass the plate. That was always my problem in church, is I'm terrible at asking for money. So, but we're here. I'm here. My name is Nat. Again, my brother John is here. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
And as always, the lovely, the delightful, the enigmatic Bethany Shea is here as well.
You right? Start using a thesaurus every time. You're going to come up with all sorts of words.
Oh, I'm nothing if not full of it. I have I can say useless things in all kinds of different words.
Definitely full of it.
Although I meant all of that. You are enigmatic.
Thank you.
So Bethany's here with us. This is the podcast that you have come to know and love, all 10 of you that listen regularly. We call it This Is Not Church because, quite frankly, if it was church, you'd be on your way out the door by now. And John and I would be like, with you? And Bethany would be like, no, come back. It can be saved. And we're like, I don't know.
Come back. We have cookies.
Come back. That's right. Come back. We have cookies. That might be the only thing I miss about church. There were always donuts and cookies.
Yes.
Although I found out I can buy donuts and cookies for myself.
But I'll have a corner.
As always, we are joined by an awesome guest, and so we're just gonna read this bio for you real quick, give you a quick introduction, and then I'm gonna let him take it from there. So we are joined today by Dennis Kennedy, a playwright, director, and theater historian. He's a Samuel Beckett Professor of Drama, Emeritus in Trinity College Dublin, born in Cincinnati and educated in California and at Oxford. I already feel like I'm out of my depth. He has published a number of award-winning books on theater and live performance. His novel Fossil Light, as published in 2023, Creating Jesus, the earliest record of Yeshua of Nazareth, appeared in 2024. And that is his most recent book and ostensibly what we're here to talk about. So without any further ado, welcome to the show. Dennis, how are you, sir?
It's very nice to be here. I'm well, thank you.
So are you currently in Ireland?
No, I'm currently in Washington for Christmas.
Oh, okay.
Normally, we live in Dublin, but we're here to visit some family.
Very cool. So by Washington, you mean Washington, D.C.? I
do.
Awesome. Okay. I lived near there for a few years. I lived in Maryland for a while and have spent quite a few times. I've gotten lost in Washington, D.C. a whole bunch. It is a very good city to get lost in. It's very easy.
It is, but not necessarily a pleasant city to get.
No, but it's easily accomplished, right? It's like, it's not hard.
Especially if you're driving.
Yeah. Well, when we first moved there, it was 1990, whatever it was, 95, I think, is when I first moved there. And GPS existed, but most people didn't have it. And so there were lots of road trips. So with my wife sitting in the passenger seat of the car with an atlas, yelling at me, no, left here, no, turn here, and trying to navigate us towards, while we end up someplace in Northeast DC going, well, we shouldn't be here. It's getting dark and we should probably go home.
What were you doing in DC, Nat?
I was in the Air Force. I was stationed at Fort Meade.
Nice.
Which is just up the road. And then I went to college at the University of Maryland College Park, which is right there in the Beltway. So,
awesome.
That was when I first joined the Air Force after I got out of tech school and everything, and spent about 7 years tromping around the East Coast. So, very cool. Well, Dennis, if you don't mind, John and I like to talk, and Bethany, I have to keep including Bethany. I'm so sorry.
I'm newer.
You are newer. You are the newer, shinier thing, and we do appreciate all of your shininess.
Yay.
But the we've been doing this a good long time, and one of the questions we always ask everybody is just to kind of give us a little bit of a understanding of your spiritual background. If you're comfortable talking about that, maybe let us know how you kind of arrived where you are today, and then we'll go from there.
Well, the book, in fact, is very much a part of what my religious upbringing was like. It was thoroughly Catholic, mostly Irish Catholic. In fact, I went to Catholic schools all the way through Jesuit University.
Wow.
So 16 years of uninterrupted Catholic education, which included an awful lot of religious and theological instruction. And though I'm not a biblical scholar by training, and certainly not a theologian, I never lost my interest in the history of Christianity, even after I lost the faith. So this book, called Creating Jesus, is about the Gospel of Mark, and its premise is that Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, and thus the earliest record that we have of the life of Jesus. And you can conclude from that, perhaps, that it might be a little closer to the original oral sources on which all the Gospels are based. So in many ways, my abandonment of Catholicism is the background for writing about something that was pretty much ignored in my 16 years of religious education.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's that I know there's a lot of discussion, especially amongst scholars, about how the four gospel accounts came to be. And I think it's pretty well consensus, right, that Mark is the earliest, and that maybe Matthew and Luke borrowed heavily from that source material. And then obviously John sort of stands alone as the non-synoptic. But is there a sense from your study and from what you've learned that Mark and Luke borrow quite a bit from Mark? Does that make sense?
Matthew and Luke. Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah.
Because 50% of Matthew and about 45% of Luke is directly copied from Mark, including word for word transcriptions, basically. Even though sometimes Luke especially has a more fluid Greek style than Mark does, he nonetheless uses the words almost exactly as they are in Mark. So I don't think there's very much doubt about that. There are occasional New Testament scholars who like to propose alternative theories about the order of composition, but I'd say 98% agree to the order that you just described.
Yeah. Well, then there's several that obviously allude to or point to or theorize about another source, right? This mysterious Q that maybe everyone borrowed from, although no one's ever been able to produce it. So who knows? I mean, it seems as likely as anything.
It doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did.
Yeah, for sure.
The theory about Q comes to the fore because Matthew and Luke have a good deal of material that Mark does not have.
Right.
But that they both have. That is, both Matthew and Luke. So the theory is that somewhere along the line, there was another source. It's true. It's called Q. It stands for the German word Quelle, which simply means source. And it's presumed to have been a list of the sayings of Jesus.
Okay.
And that's where they get a lot of their quotations that are not in Mark.
Yeah. That reminds me of Keith Giles in his treatment of the Gospel of, was it the Gospel of Thomas, John?
Yeah.
Where he says the Gospel, and I haven't really looked at the Gospel of Thomas too much, but that's kind of what the Gospel of Thomas is just a list of sayings of Jesus. It's not a narrative. It's not what we've come to expect from a gospel like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So that's interesting that Q is set up sort of in that same sort of tradition. It's like, well, here's just a bunch of things that Jesus said, and then they get worked in. But I'm curious about the title. Let's talk about the title because it seems a bit provocative. And that creating Jesus, was that intentionally provocative? Are you implying something about maybe maybe some creative license being taken with the life of Jesus or something of that nature?
Well, yeah, it is. It is intentionally provocative.
Good. I like it.
But that's what the book is really about, because the premise of the book is that we have grown so used to the entirety of the Christian story, which is taken not only from the four Gospels, but from other sources, other later sources, that we have forgotten that each of the Gospels is, in fact, a separate literary work in itself. And by looking at them, what I call looking sideways at them, seeing one in light of the other, we have, in a sense, ignored the fact that each of them wrote independently of one another, and probably each of them expected to replace the predecessors.
Oh, okay.
Why would Matthew, if he had Mark, write a gospel that deals with the same life story if he didn't expect to better it in some fashion? And we could say the same thing about Luke, who actually begins his gospel by saying, other people have written about this, but now I've done it better. And we're now going to see how well I can do it so that I can prove to you, readers, the truth of what I'm writing. And it's clear that John, which came from a totally different tradition than the other three, disregards them. So the real curiosity in the history of the New Testament is, why do we have four Gospels instead of one?
True.
And I think there are a couple of answers, and one of them I tried to give just now, that is that each of them tried to better the other and include more information and more legends and perhaps more sayings. And the other answer may be why the early church never suppressed any of the four Gospels is probably because none of them was sufficient in itself. And that, in a way, is based on, is a result of the fact that each of the evangelists was relying in part on an oral tradition. And this, of course, is especially true with Mark, since there was no written version before him. So all of his sources then were the oral tradition that we assume came down from the original apostles and other first generation disciples who passed on by word of mouth, by giving sermons or speeches or writing letters like Paul, the information that the evangelist ultimately took and put into written form. There are scholars who say that Mark's writing of a gospel is actually a very radical act that changed the nature of the information that we have about the life of Jesus. Because the early Christians, the earliest Christians, the first, second generation, were doing fine by telling stories to one another, and by trying to make sense out of the stories that they told. By writing down some of those stories, Mark actually set into effect an entirely different kind of tradition, where the stories, which might have been flexible and varied in their form and differed from place to place, suddenly were cast in stone. And that's what the Gospels are. They are solidifying something that was flexible, not necessarily always the same. In fact, probably differed significantly between Jerusalem and Antioch and Damascus and Rome, because people heard different versions of the stories and probably put their own twist on it, including making up things. Because one thing we know about oral traditions is that they tend to increase rather than decrease.
Sure.
Tend to be additive rather than subtractive.
Yeah.
And that's what you see that happens in Matthew and Luke, who add well, Mark is one half the length of the other Gospels. So Matthew and Luke added a significant amount of material that they got from somewhere or made up. And clearly Mark did not have that or did not think it was important enough to write about. So these later Gospels then can be seen as actually a kind of continuation of the oral tradition of adding to the story and making it more complete, more rounded. But to get back to the title, Creating Jesus, the point is that if you look at Mark by itself as the first gospel, you have to admit that he, for the first time, wrote down the character of Jesus. And so Creating Jesus might sound provocative, but actually all it's saying is that Mark was the first one in a literary fashion to form in writing the character that we know as Jesus. And I think you can go on and say that the character of Jesus in Matthew and in Luke are different. They're not exactly the same, and very different in John, who sees Jesus not so much as a conveyor of the word, but as the word itself.
Yeah.
So provocative, perhaps, the title, but actually also true in that Mark in many ways created the character that we know as Jesus.
Wow.
That's beautiful. When I was in seminary, one of the things that a professor asked me to do was to write on one of the Gospels. I can't remember which one, and not use any of the other Gospels to impact what I was writing. How did you write about Mark without having the other Gospels inform your perspective?
Well, I wasn't taking a test like
Good point.
You didn't have to do that.
I had them side by side all along, but
Okay.
The project began because I got fascinated with the idea that we have the earliest sources that we have, the earliest Christian documents, are the letters of Paul, which were written approximately in the decade of the 50s, and the Gospel of Mark, which was written sometime around the year 70. The others are between 10 to maybe even 30 years later. And as I said, they do something different. So I just thought, what happens if you take the earliest gospel and look at it by itself, not really disregarding the others, but seeing it as a literary document in itself. And when you do that, you find that it's actually a fascinating work. And again, assuming that it is the earliest, you could say that Mark is one of the most influential books of all time, because it was the first to present this character. Paul did not know Jesus. And what he writes about, for the most part, is the meaning of the resurrection. And what we can do, we Christians, what we can do in order to effect that form of salvation. The form of salvation in Paul is not terribly clear, but it certainly is a promise of another life, a second life. So Mark then, what he did was take whatever the belief of the earliest Christians was and put a figure at the center of it, a character on whom they could hang all of what they believed and hoped for. So you could say, in one sense, all he was doing was writing down the stories that already existed, but the act of writing is itself a creative act. And he gave it a structure, a narrative. He created or reproduced other characters and interactions. And all of that is the foundation of what we know about this man from Nazareth.
Is there any sense then that those narratives, whether it was Mark's or others, were tailored for a specific audience then, or for a particular reason. I've often wondered, we make a big deal about how Jesus in the New Testament apparently fulfills Old Testament prophecy. And I've always wondered how much of that was maybe not the invention, but maybe it was a little reading backwards into history. That makes sense. So
yeah, actually, that's exactly the phrase that I use in the book, reading backward, when dealing with that question. But the first part of your question was about, what was it?
Well, is there a sense that these narratives were written and tailored to a specific audience?
I think that's probably true. Certainly, most New Testament scholars think that each of the Gospels was written for a specific community. The trouble is that we don't know what the community might have been. And
Right.
of course, we don't know who the writers were.
Right.
Those names were associated from the earliest time, but we don't know who they were. We can be pretty sure that Matthew and John were not written by the apostles by that name. Because of the dates would have made it pretty much impossible. And we can probably assume that they didn't know Greek, or at least didn't know it well enough to write in this kind of fashion. But it's probably true that each of them was writing for a specific Christian community, and their different approaches to the story may well be because of that, because they were writing for the need of that community and responding the way Paul responds in his letters to problems that develop in those different cities that he established assemblies in. And probably you could say, well, this is a little speculative, but I think it's important to recognize that Mark himself, if he's writing about the year 70, is writing about the time of the year 70, not the time of the year 30, not the time of the crucifixion, but responding not only to the needs of the community that he was probably part of, but also to the circumstances that had changed in those 40 years. For example, in the year 70, the Roman army of Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. That might well have been a prompt for Mark to write a story about the end of time, which seemed suddenly to be a lot closer than before. And, the temple, of course, had been destroyed once before by Babylon. And so this is a kind of doubling of Jewish history, the worst, I think, possible in the Jewish mind, the destruction of the temple and of the holy city itself, that causes another dispersion of Jews throughout the empire. So that's a pretty terrible thing to contemplate, whether you were a non-Christian Jew or a Christian Jew. And maybe Mark, among other things, was picking up on a kind of an existentialist circumstance that suggested that what we had hoped for and believed isn't happening the way we thought it was going to.
Well, and there's even an opportunity, though, in there, it seems like, to ascribe some retrospective prophetic meaning to what's just happened. Now we've got Jesus prophesying the destruction of him, saying, well, I can destroy the temple and raise it back up in 3 days. And then there's all this prophetic imagery around those events. And I've always wondered if those events happened, if they were written about, years after they happened, they weren't so much prophetic as maybe a prophetic reading of history or a prophetic retelling of history.
Yeah, it's a prophecy after the fact. And it may well be true. We don't really know. I think Mark was written sometime between 65 and 75, with the destruction of Jerusalem right in the middle there.
Yeah.
I say 70 just because it's a round number. But But even if he wrote before the destruction, the Jewish war began in 66, the year 66, a big rebellion against Rome. And it went on for those 4 years, between 66 and 70. And given the way that Rome traditionally treated rebellions, anybody could think about what the likely outcome of this was going to be. Because here we had these disorganized Jewish rebels, and certainly not an army, who were rising up against the most powerful force in the world. And unless God intervened, the outcome is likely to be the one that actually happens.
As always, it's fascinating to me. And again, not a biblical scholar either. I'm not, but I'm like you. I am fascinated with how all of this came about. But it also was a point of departure for me from my evangelical upbringing, which, the narratives that I was raised with were none of these. It was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, they were the ones contemporaneous with Jesus. They were eyewitnesses to all these things, and so those words could be trusted to be true and accurate reflections of what happened. And in certain circles, we'd all be strung up for even for even suggesting that maybe there was something more, more nefarious going on. But it's fascinating to me. I wonder about the narrative that one of the things I was told about, say, the Gospel of John, for example, was that it was written specifically to address maybe a rising sense of Gnosticism in the church, and so there's quite a bit of emphasis on the divinity of Jesus and all of these things. But again, that all sounds very speculative to me as well.
Almost everything you can say about the New Testament is speculative in one way or another.
Sure.
And
fair.
And the history of Christianity is the history of the church imposing a doctrinal or theological perspective on the earliest documents. But look at something like the Nicene Creed, which was written in about 325, 326, and then look back at the earliest gospel and Paul's letters, and you'll find about half of it is not there.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot that isn't in Mark, a lot of the Christian story that isn't in Mark. For one thing, considering this is December, if we had only Mark, we wouldn't have Christmas.
Right. Yeah.
There's no genealogy. There's no Joseph. There's no Virgin Mary. No Virgin Mother, rather. I emphasize virgin. Mary appears, but she thinks her son has gone crazy and tries to stop him from preaching. He has at least 5 siblings in Mark, some of whom are named. But in addition to all that, there is no Bethlehem, no manger, no travels to Egypt, no angels of the Lord, and then certainly no wise men. And if I can make this point again in a slightly different way, when you think about Christmas pageants that children do in church or in school, or Christmas creches, you always have the wise men and the shepherds present.
Right.
Well, the wise men are only in Matthew, and the shepherds are only in Luke, and neither of them are in Mark. So that sort of demonstrates that idea of reading sideways, of seeing one gospel in light of another, instead of seeing them as individual works.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, they kind of inform the other in some ways. And to take them apart from each other is, I don't know, it makes me wonder how much of the other gospels were almost forms of propaganda in some ways against the Roman Empire, to give a different narrative about Jesus during that time. Would you say that there's any truth to that, or from your research?
Well, I don't think Rome comes out very well in the Gospels.
Not so much.
I think that what they are is, the phrase that I use is, they are belief propaganda Do they propagandize against Rome? Well, Mark doesn't really. And since we have that story about the image of Caesar on the denarius that begins in Mark, he's sort of saying he has his Jesus say. Mark's Jesus says, basically, leave them alone. These Romans. That's a Roman coin. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Rome. He doesn't say rise up against them. Perhaps it's a little more aggressive in Luke, but not all that much more. Because one of the problems, of course, of the Gospels is that from the earliest, they spin the responsibility for the crucifixion to the Jews, even though it clearly was Rome who was doing it. And in my view, at least in my view of Mark, Jesus was executed because he was a threat to order. He kept saying things that aggravated the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes. He kept saying things like, your duty is to the Father. And he went with his crowd of boys to Jerusalem at the Passover and started stirring things up. And he got all the temple establishment angry at him because he was basically saying, you need to reform. The strongest sense we get of his political position in Mark, at any rate, is that he is seeking a reformed version of the religion that he was raised in. So when Rome looks at this, when the high priest comes and says, you got to do something about this, the easy solution is to say, well, are you king of the Judeans? And in Mark, he says, who said so? It's literally what he says. Si legis means your words, kind of if you say so, or
sure,
perhaps,
I like that.
Or maybe that's what you would call me. You
Fair.
as a Roman would call me that. And that's enough, because anybody who says they're king of the Judeans was automatically in revolt against Rome.
Yeah.
So anyway, the point here is that the Gospels like to blame the high priest and the temple establishment for the execution of Jesus, but in the end, it was Rome who did it, and Pilate did it because it was an easy way to shut him up.
Yeah.
When there was, all these every Passover, thousands of Jews from all over the empire would descend upon Jerusalem, and that is a dangerous circumstance in a highly volatile province that Rome really didn't know what to do with anyway.
Yeah, I always thought it was already a powder keg, but I remember Dom Crossan pointing out something is like, well, Jesus was a threat to Rome, but he wasn't that big a threat. They crucified him, but had he been considered a violent threat, they'd have wiped everybody out. It'd have been him, all his apostles, all of his followers. They'd have gone wholesale murder on everybody. So he's like, you can kind of intuit that, yeah, they didn't like him. It was they crucified him to shut him up. Thought that would be enough to scare his followers, into submission and go, hey, don't be like your leader here. But so much has been made of the persecution of Christians by Rome, and I think exaggerated quite a bit. I think scholars mostly agree that persecution has been greatly exaggerated, but that also feeds into that narrative, doesn't it? That sort of persecution mode that, we're a small sect of persecuted believers up against this, the enormous empire of Rome. But that seems to be a narrative that we Christians still like very much.
Well, we do, or perhaps I should say they do.
Yeah, fair.
I guess I'm a kind of Christian, but not a believing one. Well, Crossan knows what he's talking about, obviously, and he makes a good point there. crucifixion was very common.
Yeah.
And after all, there's 3 guys are hanging by 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
On that day. And, is it surprising that there was no record in Rome of that? No. It's such a common occurrence in a restless province like Palestine. It might well have been a daily occurrence. And nobody seems very surprised by this in the Gospels, and especially again in Mark. So I think that's a good point, that you didn't have to offend the power of Rome very much in order to wind up pinned to the tree.
Yeah, for sure. No, the stories are always, they abound that they crucified people by the tens of thousands. They ran out of wood. There were enemies to cower into submission. That's a pretty good way. Don't get me wrong. It's effective.
It's very effective.
Doesn't like rolling up and seeing, the streets lined with, people hanging on crosses, of whatever shape or fashion they were. But I also do think that we have, I remember sitting in churches and hearing sermons about how Jesus died the most brutal death of any human who ever lived. And I'm like, that just can't possibly be true. Don't get me wrong. It was not pleasant. It was not good. But we humans are pretty inventive. We've come up with pretty good ways of inflicting pain on one another. So, there's
and apparently we haven't stopped.
Oh, no.
Well, what I was taught, especially in my early years by nuns, was that this pain was so intense because he was divine and because he didn't need to suffer it. That was the Catholic twist.
I got you.
On the same thing that you are just saying. So I guess that takes it into a kind of divine psychology, that sort of explanation. In any event, not pleasant.
No, for sure. No, but
well, and I think that sometimes when we make it all about the suffering and the pain that Christ went through on the cross, not to negate that in any form, it takes away from the fact that he was killed like a common criminal, like everybody else was killed in that time. So it kind of elevates his death as this divine sacrifice instead of recognizing that he was a victim of imperialistic violence. And instead of trying to stop the violence in that space, he allowed the violence to happen to show that he could overcome the violence of the world through a nonviolent sort of resistance and resurrection. There's a lot there and everything, but I think sometimes when we make the cross into this like special thing that happened only to Jesus, we don't recognize the reality of the suffering of millions or hundreds of thousands of people during that time at the hands of a dictatorship, sort of Roman imperialistic way of violently leading. And I think that the cross is powerful in of the fact that that violence is powerful, and that we subject violence on people all the time and justify violence on people, whereas Christ was one that was non-violent. And there's a lesson there for us.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And in fact, I've often thought, I haven't thought this through, so it's kind of top of the head. But it often occurs to me that choosing the cross as the idealized icon of Christianity is a very double-edged thing, because it places torture at the center of Christianity, and the very identity of a Christian is through the cross. So it is a kind of curious, problematic issue. It's understandable, perhaps inevitable. We saw that, in the Roman catacombs, it was already carved on the wall by the end of the first century. So, but there was also the fish, and the fish is a more interesting kind of image for a symbol of a movement, because it is not only a sign of life and life-giving, But it's also a kind of very distinctive thing that reminds us of where Jesus came from, where he preached, where he had his following, out in these rural hinterlands of Galilee, among men who were workers like himself in various trades, including fishing.
Well, it reminds me also of like how, you're talking about Mark's gospel and how Mary isn't really mentioned much in that gospel, especially her virginity. And this time of year during Christmas, this is when we are recording this, is during Advent. Mary's virginity is kind of placed on the forefront of our minds in many ways. And it's almost like that's the most important thing about her, is this perpetual virginity. And that has damaged a lot of women over the years and girls within purity culture, believing that to be revered in God's eyes, to be blessed in God's eyes, is to be a virgin and to be pure, or whatever that means. I don't know. I think that sometimes we can take these parts of scripture that are important and beautiful, and we can elevate it into something that it was never meant to be in the first place. It was meant to point to something different. It was going to point to, some sort of a miracle that God was doing through Mary instead of her perpetual virginity as the most important thing about her.
I'll say something about virginity in a minute, but we might begin by noting that the habit of reading backward was customary in Judaism as well. Looking into the Hebrew scriptures for information or prophecy about the present was already common. And in a way, that is the beginning of the problem about Mary's virginity. Matthew is the first writer that we have who calls her a virgin. And he does it because there's a prophecy in Isaiah that, behold, it says that a Savior will be born and of a virgin. And that's how it's usually translated at any rate. The word that Isaiah uses in Hebrew is Alma, which means young girl. Now, just like the word young girl in English, the phrase, it implies a virgin. But certainly Isaiah did not mean that that this future unnamed woman would conceive without sexual congress. When Matthew, for the first time, wrote about the virginity issue, he drew upon that phrase, but he used a word in Greek, parthenos, which actually does mean virgin. So by quoting back and, in a sense, kind of changing the implication of the word that Isaiah uses, he began this, or solidified a tradition, maybe, that already existed, that she was conceived not by human means. But more interesting than that is the fact that nobody before Matthew talked about virginity at all. And as I said earlier, it's pretty clear in Mark that Jesus got a lot of siblings. And certainly nobody talked about perpetual virginity, meaning that Mary remained a virgin after giving birth and remained a virgin for the rest of her life until the middle of the 2nd century.
Well, I have off the top of my head too. I'm like you. I'm riffing now. All right, Dennis, we're riffing. Would the Bible, or would the Torah, Old Testament, however you want to phrase it, that Mark or that Luke or the writers of these Gospels have been exposed to, would have maybe have been the Septuagint? And does the Septuagint maybe translate that Hebrew word in the Greek as that?
It did. You're absolutely right.
And that's just, of course, I'm just wondering about that, because that would make sense if he's reading from the Greek, and in the Greek they've translated that word into that specific Greek word, that it would then come forward into that gospel.
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. The Septuagint does use the word parthenos.
Well, that's something that's fairly new to me, because it's not something we talk about in evangelical circles a bunch, that there are these two versions. You do have the Hebrew and the LXX, or whatever you want to have, whichever way you want to refer to it. And there are at times massive differences. I mean, there are very, very, in fact, one of the ones that pops into my mind is the verse that says, and I think it's Habakkuk that talks about how our hearts are wicked. Is that from Habakkuk?
In the heart is full of deceit. Is that?
Yeah, it's wicked and deceitful above all things, and it's like beyond curing. It's terrible. And the Septuagint does not say that. It says the heart is complex. It is complicated. And it's like, well, those two things don't mean the same thing at all. Like, I could agree with the one, but one is used, as John and I are born and raised in like non-denominational, evangelical circles. That was leveraged against us, saying, listen, the Bible says you're terrible. It says you can't trust your heart. It's wicked and deceitful above all things. It's this horrible thing. And that's Jeremiah, now that I'm thinking about it. But so I wonder about that because that the virginity of Mary is such a big issue for some people. And I've often wondered if that's just a mistranslation of that word, and why has that become a sticking point that has backed us into a corner? And you said you had something else to say about virginity. I'm curious what else.
Well, that was it. That was it.
Okay. Well, because from my perspective, that whole thing's, virginity in and of itself is a construct. It is this thing that we've imposed on women in particular to somehow assign value or worth to whether or not they've had sex. And so I'm sure Bethany experienced this as, growing up with purity culture and those kinds of things. And to a lesser extent, John and I as men did. But outside of our culture, you go back to, I don't know, it just seems like a weird place to land as far as how we're going to make judgments on people based on this. But had they just said that Jesus, the Savior, whoever, would have been born of a young girl, we got no question there. Fine, that's prophecy fulfilled, doesn't require any particular set of magic or spells to be cast or whatever.
But there are some questions with that. There is something very unsettling about the age of Mary, and I know it was cultural and everything, but it is something that makes me want to be like, I'm not comfortable with this part. I preached on it on Sunday, and I was just like, very honest, like this. I feel like we're meant to be uncomfortable in Scripture, because if we're not uncomfortable, then we might not wrestle with it. But yeah, young girls also. Are
we uncomfortable with the fact that she might have been betrothed to be married at 12 or 13, or that maybe the Holy Spirit had somehow it forced himself upon her?
Yeah.
Because that to me sounds like a little rapey.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a rapey element to all of that makes me uncomfortable as hell.
I know.
Well, again, isn't it another point of, reading backwards for prophecy, right?
Sure, for sure.
So Mark is writing about this Messiah, and he needs certain prophecies to come true, correct?
Yeah, and he didn't talk about the Virgin Mary at all, but
I'm just saying. I understand.
Things, yeah. But the suffering servant, right? We had the whole thing with the suffering servant Isaiah. And I don't, I'm not enough of a Bible scholar to remember where these narratives happen in the Gospels, but there's very specific callbacks, right?
Absolutely.
To when Jesus quotes Psalm 22, when we have all these things that surround him, like his, he didn't have any bones broken. Well, that's what Isaiah said about the suffering servant, that no bones his bones would be put out of joint, but they wouldn't be broken. And so they go to break his legs, as was custom, I guess, at some point to hasten the end. And they find him he's already died, so it didn't have to happen. So prophecy fulfilled, bones not broken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Hebrew scriptures are large, and though they were written over a long period of time, they tend in Christianity, whether evangelical or not, they tend to be seen as a single unit. And there's part of what I'm saying about the four Gospels. We ought to look at them individually rather than as a unit. And the same thing should be true about the Old Testament. But in Christianity, that has not been the way. There's a further point to continue this business about virginity. An awful lot of what became absolute doctrine in the church, in the early church, and has been retained by most Christian sects, is the result of logical, of backing oneself into a logical corner.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes, sir.
here the virginity thing is a good example of that. If you think that original sin exists and that every human being, when born, is already condemned unless he or she is later saved, baptized, etc., then you have a problem about the Virgin Mary, about Mary. And
Yes,
you
you
have
do.
to start calling her a virgin because then somehow she gets excused from original sin. And of course, this is the Immaculate Conception. But somehow, God already knew she was going to be the mother of the Savior, so she couldn't be stained like the
Yeah. Well, and then the mythology then continues, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Well, then since Jesus is not conceived in a natural way, he has his Virgin Mother, who's apparently excused somehow, and then his Holy Spirit Father. Well, then Jesus can be born without stain or blemish. He's not subject to the same original sin, although he has to be baptized by John the Baptist, who baptizes for forgiveness of sins. And I wonder at some point, my brain does this thing where I wonder if we had taken a different tack with this whole thing, and rather than setting Jesus so far apart, had embraced him as somebody who was in solidarity with all of us. Look, you were born into the same crap we were born into, with the same propensity to sin as the rest of us, with, into family situations and circumstances that weren't ideal, and into poverty perhaps, and all these things. And rather than say, this is the clarion call, is that we now have a brother who is in solidarity with us, we went the opposite way and set him as an ideal that was impossible to attain. Somebody who's, that's the sort of, one of the hallmarks of evangelical Christianity is, we're supposed to aspire to be like Jesus, but you'll never be like Jesus. And I'm wondering if we aren't way closer than we thought.
Yes.
And had we maybe would have had a much different faith, it would have looked different. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a good point of view. And I do talk about this in the book too, in a slightly different kind of way, which is over the problem of exactly what is the relationship of Jesus to Yahweh. And I tend to fall down on the side of adoptionism, that early heresy of the church, which said that Jesus wasn't divine, but was adopted as the Son of God at his baptism. And that's pretty much what Mark does, skipping out all that genealogy about tracing him back to David and back to Adam, and skipping out the birth and not foregrounding the mother as a loving virgin. All of this points in Mark to emphasizing the fact that what is important is not so much the man, but the message that he carries.
Yeah.
And that message is what he keeps saying. You don't have to believe in me. You just have to trust in the Father. And then all things are possible. And the Father has told me to do these things, and I can do them because of the Father. The miracles and the sense of forgiving sins and the exorcisms and the healings, most significantly, the healings. All of this, he never ascribes to his own power, but always to the Father. So he's an agent of the Father, and he's the Son of God, in my view, in the sense that he has been chosen by the Father, like the expected Messiah in Judaism, who was going to be a man like David, who could conquer the Roman Goliath, but not a God in himself.
Yeah. Well, then that sheds new light then on the baptism scene, where, the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, and you hear the voice of God who says, "This is my son." That could very well mean what you just said. And the message for the rest of us is what God the Father has done for Jesus, God the Father will do for all of us. Could we all not be adopted as sons of God? Could we all not be brought into the family?
And that's language that Paul uses over and over again.
I love that.
Adoption and sonship. Yeah.
In fact,
I think I like heresy. This sounds like fun. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is heretical. In fact, in the Hebrew scriptures, the phrase "son" or "sons of God" is applied to the nation of Israel itself, in the sense that all people are children of God, in that kind of meaning. But it's another example of, a lot of Christian doctrine resulted as by taking Jewish terms out of context. Nobody, as far as I can understand, no Jew in the first century expected a Messiah to offer him a place in heaven. The Messiah was going to get rid of Israel's enemies and restore the ancient kingdom. That's what God's kingdom is, or at least in part, in Mark at any rate. An imagined kingdom on earth where peace would reign and Israel would again be a sign of the glory of God. Of course, this is terribly heretical, even in that by the end of the first century. But it's my view.
Yeah,
and so based on a reading of Mark, and I'm reading Mark not as a theologian, but as a reader, as somebody trained in literature and in performance, to look at a text and see it for itself, in itself.
Well, and that's man, something I meant to ask you about too. Is that so? In your training as a playwright, and so does that influence? It has to, I would think, influence that you view this narrative as almost theatrical in how it's playing out. Like, these are the scenes, this is the backdrop, these are the characters and how they relate. There has to be some sense of the structure and the flow of that whole thing that must compel someone like you who thinks in those terms anyway.
Yes, absolutely. And there was a further aspect to it, that if the Gospel of Mark is based upon an oral tradition, you have to start thinking about what happens when you write down speech. What happens to that speech? It's now no longer speech. And yet at the same time, we must remember that the literacy rate in Palestine was about 2 to 3%. Everybody got their information and entertainment through the spoken word. And that is how the Gospels would first have been heard as well. Nobody was reading them. Or I shouldn't say nobody. Ordinary people were not reading them because they couldn't read. They were going to assemblies like the synagogue and hearing the words spoken.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is something that continues in contemporary Christianity.
Yeah. Well, and then I wonder, it makes me wonder if some of it was even, because Douglas Campbell, Paul, great Pauline theologian, talks about the gospel, talks about the epistles and how they would have been circulated with readers who would have essentially acted out and voiced the different parts of these. So we read them as monologues, and they weren't. There were dialogues involved, and so they were acted out. And I wonder if that I can envision a scenario where the gospels the gospel message is being told, and it's essentially being acted out, in front of people, almost like a little play, which makes a ton of sense to me that it would be that kind of compelling storytelling. And that, like you said, like these sort of almost fishtails, they always get bigger. But as soon as you write them down, now we have this and we can't deviate from. Does kind of make you wonder what would have happened if we just stuck with an oral tradition, what we would have ended up with. But man, all of this is, gosh, Dennis, this is fascinating, man. If I hate to wrap it up, but I know we're getting close and it's late for some of us, but you're later than the rest. It's almost 9 o'clock. Or after 9 o'clock. We're in Washington, but I just wanted to say I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm a fan of the heretical, so I'm compelled. I think you make very compelling arguments, though. I know we throw that word around. So we kind of tongue in cheek, we throw that around, but I find a lot of what you're talking about very compelling. I'm going to have to do some research on adoptionism. I'm very curious about that now. But the book is fascinating. I think your perspective is unique on this, and man, I don't have much else to add except say thank you. John, Bethany, I'll leave you guys some final words if you have them.
I same. Just thank you for taking the time to talk with us. This has been an amazing conversation that I thoroughly enjoyed.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad we could get it together finally. So the book again is titled Creating Jesus, the earliest record of Yeshua of Nazareth. Our guest has been Dennis Kennedy. We will link to everything in the show notes. You need to get this book. I think it would be I think if nothing else, a conversation starter. It'll be a little bit of a mind bender, which I think is always welcome. But thanks again. I appreciate you taking the time for us, man.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.